Mordheim City of the Damned is a 2015 game by Rogue Factor Studio. It's one of the most interesting games I've played. That's because its problems are so obvious it's puzzling. In adapting the Mordheim board game, a lot of weird decisions were made that just slow everything down and mess everything up. It's not irredeemable. I can see how someone could think the good parts outweigh the bad ones and the jank, but if more people had pointed out this game's problems, maybe Necromunda, its spiritual successor, would have come out better. Let's begin. Mordheim is set in the Warhammer universe, specifically in the titular city. It was an opulent place until a comet hit, killing people and spreading around Wordstone crystals, which are magic rocks with a plethora of sought-out properties. All sorts of factions are now engaged in a gigantic free-for-all in the mostly abandoned city.
An endless pilgrimage of the greedy and ambitious fighting and dying in a place now called the City of the Damned.
And the first thing you do in Mordheim is select one of these factions. There's 6 of them. They play fairly differently from each other and they all have story missions. Between races, these missions occasionally reuse maps and concepts, but most of them have enough variations to keep them fresh. Your choices are Mercenaries, in it for the coin and with a pretty standard roster, Sisters of Sigmar, sturdy warrior nuns with miracles but no ranged weapons, Skaven, fast and cowardly ratmen, hard to hit, hard hitting but frail, and the Cult of the Possessed, Chaos Worshippers that get random mutations as they level up. There's also 2 DLC factions. The Witch Hunters play like a mix between the Sisters and the Mercenaries, Miracles, Fire, Gunpowder and Zealots. Vampires are undead, necromancers and ghouls. Your vampire leader accounts for most of the leadership and causes terror. He is an outstanding fighter but also a game-winning target. After choosing, you assemble your team by recruiting level 0 heroes, henchmen and your faction's big guy called the Impressive Warrior. Unless you've just started the game, there's some meta progression elements that make fresh starts a lot easier. Chiefly the option to start a warband from level 5 instead of level 0, having all types of warriors unlocked from the beginning instead of having to grind for them. This allows you to have a greater variety of options straight away for both characters and store-bought equipment. The so-called veteran system also gives you some perks of your choosing, like receiving free items and reducing the cost of pretty much everything. All new recruits start at level 0. If they survive, they gain experience. If they get taken out, they might suffer permanent injuries, which range from losing 1 agility to losing 1 arm. They add a lot of personality to your warband when they don't outright kill your characters or make them useless. Let's talk about these missions. If available and if you choose to do so, you start by deploying your warband. You should always try to make this happen. Random starts are a good way to get one of your men eliminated in turn 1 without you being able to do anything about it. There's various kinds of missions with little intros by the narrator talking about the situation.
As your warband disperses and begins to explore, however, an enemy warband arrives. An enemy warband arrived and deployed patrols to intercept your warriors. A spy has reported that an enemy warband is hurrying to recover a secret cache of equipment in the area.
But this is all flavor text. Aside from your starting position, all types play the same. There's secondary objectives that go from easy to never happening that give your people more experience. There's Wordstone to gather and later sell in big shipments for lots of money, and other loot points containing items. Your main objective is always killing all the enemies or making them rout. Your reward is always a percentage of the unclaimed loot, which increases depending on the difficulty. Despite the fact that your starting situation, loot density, enemy warband and secondary objective changes from match to match, they all play the exact same way. Gather loot until you meet the enemy, fight the enemy, win and automatically end the mission. Rather than the sameness though, my biggest problem is the massive amount of time wasted. For some reason, the devs thought that the best way to adapt a tabletop game was to make it third person. What would have been a simple click in a tile-based game, in Mordheim requires you to slowly walk your character around. You move by spending strategy points, which you can refund by just walking back, meaning that you can scout ahead and retreat unless you get ambushed, overwatched, or you step into a trap. This adds a decent element of risk-reward, although maybe traps would be easier to avoid if the camera wasn't constantly jerking around or focusing on a nearby wall. There is however a line-of-sight mechanic for ranged weapons, which works fairly well. It only let me down a couple of times. The trade-off is that there's a lot of time spent walking back and forth. Sometimes you need to be very precise when moving to avoid wasting strategy points, and other times you'll be forced to go back and plan a slightly more efficient route to get within range of the enemy. Once you're engaged, you attack them by using offensive points. Some weapons cost more than others, you need to reload the ranged ones, and there's abilities you can use for some extra cost that have a variety of effects. You can also counterattack with offensive points, which means attacking first isn't always a good idea. So this whole system doesn't sound too bad, but what I absolutely despise is how long everything takes. Walking is slow. Attacking is slow. Looting is slow. And every single time you end your turn with a stance, which is pretty much always, this fucking animation plays. And every single time it plays, I can feel the ravages of time acting in fast forward. With every click of the mouse, you commit yourself to waiting 7 seconds or so before you can do anything else. Even delaying your turn plays that animation. You guys have no idea how much dead time there is in this game. I'm gonna say at least a third of the playtime is spent doing absolutely nothing other than feeling your prostate growing. Make sure you have the AI speed up option enabled, otherwise you'll even have to stare at your ogre's ass while the AI moves in real time outside of your vision. It should really be on by default. Add the wonky deployment system, the wheel UI that forces you to scroll to every single action, and the aiming of AoE abilities, and this game becomes just a chore to play. It doesn't matter how good your combat is if playing the game feels like watching a video that buffers every 5 seconds. Low experience missions are bland, you've got a couple of starting abilities, but rolls can go either way because everyone's defensive and offensive options are just mediocre. Good luck passing a terror test against vampires, by the way. But as you level up, everyone starts getting more skills, more spells, more offensive and strategy points, and more stats. Although, little parenthesis, I really hate how the characters get stat points at arbitrary percentages of a level, and that you can only use them on one of 3 groups of skills. At the very least, the game should tell you what they're going to get to make character building easier. Speaking of, there's a lot of variety. Sure, there's completely useless skills like free leap attempt at minus 15% chance. Wow, I save a whole strategy point for a higher chance of falling flat on my ass and wasting 4 turns getting back up? Or 10% damage reduction but lose 20 HP. So it's only worth it if you're expecting to take more than 200 damage in a turn. So useless that nobody noticed the damage text being bugged. Once you get a feeling for combat, however, you'll be able to identify the good skills at a glance. For defensive option, your best choices early on are parry or dodge. You can get them quite high and there's stances that allow you up to 3 attempts. types, or combine them, like this one that allows a dodge attempt after an ambush. But later on you can have pretty high armor, which is a flat damage reduction and also absurdly high melee resistance, basically making it very unlikely for anything to hit you. For damage, you might want to go for solid abilities like Strong Blow, 50% more damage, but as your precision gets higher, it might be worth it to go for critical chance builds, or to get ways to reduce the enemy's armor and melee defense. Magic too is something to consider, but you don't really want a pure caster character because each spell you cast increases the possibility of repercussions, which sometimes aren't a problem at all and other times. Yeah. Finally, the big guys play very differently. You can make them sponges to tank enemies, you can make them damage dealers, you can build other characters around supporting them, and so on. The various classes starts with very different abilities and stats, but each race also has 6 unique skills, half active and half passive, that you can skill up for even more variation, meaning there's no such thing as a standard build you need to go for every single run. So, is this a game with deep, satisfying, strategic combat buried beneath a lot of wasted time? No, it really isn't. The AI just isn't up to par at all. It is one of the most pathetic things I've ever seen. First off, it is incredibly buggy. It will get stuck on absolutely everything, even their own abilities. If they get too close to a ledge, they seem to have trouble finding the jump or climb prompt and will just stand there in perpetuity. Yet another reason why the third-person movement system was a mistake. Then, even when they do work properly, their actions are incredibly stupid. They attack first and cast damage buffing spells later. They get into dodge stance when they should parry. They willingly walk into ambushes, and whenever they see an enemy they just focus it relentlessly. At brutal enough difficulty, there's a chance that neutral demons spawn. Unless you bump into them, they're always an asset because the enemy doesn't even try staying clear of them. They just run in and start punching. While the AI knows where your warriors are once they're spotted, before that it will spread out to try and find them. So, by just not splitting your warband, you'll be able to pick the enemy off one by one as they slowly trickle to your location. It's a foolproof tactic. Further making the missions too easy is the random enemy equipment. The rival warband matches your rating, which is the total value of your skill and equipment. But sometimes they just spawn with knives instead of better weapons. Sometimes you'll be assaulted by a gang of amputees and their builds never make any sense. This lady is a scenario specific character that gets random abilities, presumably the same way enemies do, and she has a skill for ranged weapons despite her class not being able to equip any. At higher mission difficulty, enemies get a much needed health, damage and rating buff, meaning they have better stats and better equipment than you, but sometimes these end up being easier than the lower difficulty ones. Not only there's the demons I talked about, but there's also a chance to play a special ambush scenario, meaning that randomly you might be the one ambushing the enemy. You'd think higher difficulty require more people, but enemy numbers and warrior types always match your own. So, since enemies get stat buffs, the more people you bring, the more difficult it will be. So you try to not bring any henchmen, since they might get slaughtered in a single turn, and you don't bring impressives, since they're the ones benefiting the most from the difficulty buff. Still, you probably want to bring them along sometimes, because leveling is really slow on its own, and only doing 4-man battles means it will take a while to get your warband going. The reason you want your people to be as strong as possible is story missions.
Best good way to fight man-things is to use sewers. Fool me never thinks to look in sewers.
These missions have pre-decided enemies and a fixed rating. The farther you are from it, the higher difficulty it will be. That's 2 reasons to bring everyone you can. A third reason is that you might need a lot of inventory space. Story missions are unique, there's objectives to complete, enemies cannot route, and their reinforcements keep coming. A lot of them are so huge it takes several turns to traverse them, and that's without counting the endless enemies you have to fight. In general, they end up taking more more than an hour. Some are pretty straightforward, while others have a lot of busy work that drags everything on. Difficulty wise, it's not always terrible. Every single enemy will hold its position unless you spot them, meaning that you can just fight them one at a time with your whole warband. You might think it's a terrible idea in a game that's already so slow, but Mordheim is supposedly about making the best out of a bad situation. Sometimes it goes the extra mile trying to earn that tagline. Example: Chaos Campaign Act 1-2. You begin by entering a courtyard and being fired on by 4 people. Hope you brought lots of ranged weapons, otherwise you better get to cover. There's a corridor to the right that has a demon laying in ambush. If you send someone there, it better be prepared to take on a bloodletter one-on-one. Alternatively, spot it and try to lure it in the open where you can fight it with more people while being shot at by the various enemy gunners. Alternatively, you can go to the left at the end of the courtyard where you will fight an ogre. Let's say you brought enough ranged weapons and you take down the ogre. Your objective is to reach the top of this building where there's an altar. Once you reach the altar, the game tells you to gather skulls, which are scattered all around the place. Some of them are down below in the dungeon. This is a T-shaped corridor with doors that can only be closed from the outside, and there's that demon fighting enemy reinforcements on the opposite side. I decide I want nothing to do with that and just send a guy down the corridor to get the skulls. And there's a monster closet. Am I playing Doom? This didn't kill my run. I locked an henchman with the 2 demons, they got stuck and he ran for his life. I got all the skulls and just had to place them, but before I could finish...
A new round has started.
The problem is that I started this warband from level 1 and I dared trying to complete the second story level without grinding for an impressive warrior, which meant I had to avoid the demons. The only person that could take on them was the Dramatis Personae. They're special characters that you get only in story missions. They're very strong, but if they die, it's game over. You can't risk them too much, but if you want to retreat without penalties, you can suicide them to get out and try again the following day. And speaking of essential characters, wanna see the fastest I lost a mission? I still can't decide if casters being smited is hilarious or infuriating. At least it happened right away. The first time I played this level, I spent a week disabling all these boss buffing pillars, and once I did, I figured I didn't need these scenario provided characters anymore, so I used them to soak up some damage from the boss. Big mistake. This other one in theory isn't too bad. It's the second to last one for the mercenaries and it's just 4 demons and a boss. Too bad it's all demoniettes that pierce through armor, cause stupidity and cannot be parried. If you have a high parry chance but no melee resistance, and if you don't have somebody with guidance to stop stupidity, these are gonna be tough fights. The boss is sitting in the middle, stuck of course, so you shoot her to death. Except, once it dies, it respawns immediately and you get a new objective to gather some special wordstone. Now the boss fight actually starts, in a room that gives your people lower chances to hit, with a boss that always goes first and whose death you need to time. If you didn't clear the rest of the level before this happens, whoever you send to get the wordstone will have to fight demons and strong reinforcements while someone else keeps the Allures occupied. And for some reason the reinforcing marauders have both weapons and weapon mutations? For me, Mordheim really isn't about making the best out of a bad situation. Mordheim is about grinding easy skirmishes until your warband is farmed enough, and then embarking in incredibly long dickish levels. And if RNG really hates you and your characters get put out of action, they either get a debilitating injury or they don't. If they do, you just fire the injured guy and either start from scratch or hire a substitute if you have enough money. Both options require the same thing: more grinding of endless mind-numbing skirmishes. I finished Mordheim twice with a win rate of 94 and 96%, the latter playthrough I only ever failed story missions. No wonder so few finished this game. You go from boring matches that you can only fail with a lot of bad rolls and where any skill build will do, to overwhelming levels that are designed to take you by surprise and that require specific builds to beat. But despite how annoying, unfair or buggy they can be, these missions are still the best part of the game. Sure, maybe the first time they make you want to hug a bloodthirster, and all the regular time wasters this game has are even more prevalent as you spend several turns getting items from one side of the map to another. But entering a level and getting my ass handed to me while I learn the layout and the goals only to come back with optimized builds and a plan, it's incredibly satisfying. It's just that all that's in between story missions is trash, and you're always a crit away from losing 4 hours of progress. This is going to be the weakest compliment I ever give any game, but if you do have a way to entertain yourself while playing the regular missions, a video in the background for example, you might just have fun with Mordheim, if you're the kind of person that gets excited about a build coming together thanks to a 10% extra melee resistance. Just keep most skirmishes to a smaller number of people, say 4 to 6, so you'll spend significantly less time moving them around and watching animations. Okay, that was Mordheim City of the Damned. It would have worked way better as a tile-based top-down strategy game. It tried doing something unique, deviating from tabletop in favor of a more personal approach, but it ends up being grindy, slow, mostly unchallenging with some difficulty spikes that teeter between satisfying challenge and infuriating mess. It has a lot of flavor and can be pretty macabre, visuals and music do their job, and the whole combat system is very fun to tinker with, but I can't recommend Mordheim. If only it had a mod to straight up skip some animation, if the AI didn't constantly get stuck, if enemy warbands had some builds that made any sense, if the various maps were in any way interesting, and if there was some way to scout out or gather information on story levels, aside from looking them up on a guide I guess, then I could recommend it, but despite this I don't hate it either. In fact, I think I'll try finishing it at least one more time to see what I've missed. I'm just not going to pay very much attention to it outside of story missions. Thanks for watching. See ya.